Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of the Healing Arts Encounters in Art and Medicine. Is the microphone on? Sound is doesn't sound.
We can turn up the volume here.
No, I don't think so. Evening, everyone. This sounds better, no? And welcome to this new edition of the Healing Arts Encounters in Art and Medicine here at the Charité Berlin. I am Lucas Feireis and have the pleasure of guiding you through tonight's dialogue. It's a very, very warm day in Berlin, and hence we have a little less people in the audience. But thank you for coming. I'm very happy about this. Who of you, I see a lot of faces that I know from last time, and of you is here for the first time? Just one, great. And for the ones that are in the room again, I think by now I know who comes from the medical discipline and who more from the artistic field, but can the medical professionals raise their hand quickly? And then from the art and design related world? Yeah, good. So I'd say today we're a bit more than half on the medical side, and the rest is then within the field of arts. So as you all know, the series was born out of the conviction that the arts are not merely complementary to the practice of medicine, but fundamental to how we understand, experience, and enact healing as individuals and as society. And tonight continues our shared exploration of how artistic and medical practices can intersect in ways that are experimental, embodied, and transformative. And rather than offering fixed answers, we open a space for conversation, a space that welcomes the complexity of experience, the knowledge, the senses, and the richness of ambiguity. And in a world shaped by crises, ecological, psychological, social, you name it, the need for new forms of listening, learning, and healing has never been greater. And with each session, we attempt to hold that space, not as a prescription, but as an invitation. And each time we ask those of you who need also the credit points to send us reflections. And we received a lot of beautiful reflections. And my dear colleague, Vanessa Weiss, who is the coordinator of the Network for Art and Medicine here at the Charité, will read some of them to you. So thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much. So before we start today's session, I would like to briefly return to some of the reflections from last week to open a few resonant perspectives that we received from all of you. So Yasmin Nayal reflected on the topic of liminality, living between cultures, identities, and places, and how art can bridge those in-between spaces. She linked embodiment and epigenetics, showing how emotional and cultural experiences are carried in the body, not just in the mind. Then we had Marilyn Wu, who emphasized how interdisciplinary collaboration creates new spaces beyond the mind and body split. Her core insight: science can explain, but art makes us feel, allowing access to what's invisible or unspeakable. And then we had also Yu Hao, who brought in a cultural lens, connecting Chinese shamanic practices with contemporary pressures on use, not yaos. Her reflections showed how ritual and modern artistic expression together shape healing across generations. So as we begin today, I invite us and all of you to carry the sense of listening across discipline and across experiences into the conversation ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. And then we come to tonight's two remarkable guests whose work moves fluidly between disciplines, geographies, and ways of knowing. Let's start with you. Hannah Strohmeier, Dr. Hannah Strohmeier, draws on interdisciplinary background in literature, media, global health, and humanitarian studies. We met, I think it was like 2 years ago. And if I remember correctly, it was via Stefan Willich that recommended you to get in touch with me. something like this. This was just at the beginning of the Healing Arts series, and we met actually just around the corner here for coffee, and you told me about your research, and then we actually also tried to apply for funding for a common project, which eventually didn't work out, but now we are here together again, which is beautiful. Your postdoctoral research at the Charité focuses on the mental health of humanitarian workers, a topic you also bring to life through the medium of film. You'll talk about it tonight. And Hannah's work asks not only what care means in crisis, but also how we narrate and witness vulnerability in global context. And Danny Miller, is the founder and CEO of Spora Health. Is reshaping how primary care is delivered, especially for communities of color. And Danny and I met last year, I think only. Was it? No? It's also a funny connection, all comes together then, through a common friend, Irena Fernandez Acras, and she is an artist and performer based here in Berlin who participated in one of the very first kind of public events I did on the intersection of art and medicine with the Wirth Stiftung also 2 years ago. So it all comes together. With a background in writing, design, and performance, Danny's approach to healthcare innovation is as much poetic as it is systemic. His work invites us to consider design itself of services, relationships, and institutions as a form of healing practice. And together, Hannah and Danny remind us that healing is not linear and not always clinical. It's relational, it's cultural, it's creative. So we will begin tonight, as each time that we meet here, with brief opening thoughts from each of our speakers, followed by a conversation between them, and as always, time for questions and shared reflections from all of you. So thank you so much for being here. Let's begin. And the mic is yours, Hannah.
Thanks. Soll da noch was machen? Yeah. So thank you so much for coming. It's really nice to be here with you, and I especially appreciate it today because it's so warm and sunny outside, and still you made it, so that's really wonderful. And okay, all right. So my research that I've been focusing on the last 10, 12 years or so looks at humanitarian staff health. So in essence, I ask, how do people who work for large organizations such as the UN or NGOs feel at work? And why do they feel the way they do? And so in the health community, which is my major or my main background, racism is very well acknowledged as a key social determinant of health, particularly of mental health. But at the same time, we have very limited systematically collected data about how racism shows up or how it manifests in the humanitarian workplace and what the psychosocial implications are for staff. And so then in 2022, I started a research project which looks at exactly that intersection. And what I'm going to do now is I will introduce briefly a few of these research results. And then I will focus mainly on one key output of this project, a documentary film, which has proven to be a very useful and suitable medium or form of art to communicate research results to my target audience, which are humanitarian workers and their organizations. So we started off by publishing a paper, a secondary analysis of data undertaken with UN staff based in Geneva. And the key point of that paper really is to show that racism continues to be a very significant and ongoing concern within humanitarian organizations. And most of the people who have either personally experienced racism or witnessed racism responded in that survey that they had taken no action to respond to these incidences of discrimination. And when they were asked why, the main reason they cited were, well, we have very limited trust in the organization and we are very scared of retaliation. Also, as part of the survey, people were asked, well, so if that's the case, what do you recommend the UN should be doing to address the issue of racism? And so people came up with a whole lot of different recommendations. A lot of them focused on much needed large-scale structural changes. But people also said, well, what we need is more research because we don't understand well enough yet the situation in our own house. And we also need more awareness raising and advocacy work to make the point that this is really a topic we should all be focusing on and we need to discuss. And in that context, people were saying, well, we don't just need another online training. What we want to have is testimonies. We want to have visuals. We want to see people's stories. And so again, our objective or our idea to make a documentary about this research was very much matching the demands from the communities that we study. And that obviously in science is a very good idea to, especially when it's focused on social justice, to produce something that's actually of use for the people you work with. Now, this documentary, it's titled Color. It was produced in 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya. It's a bit longer than 1 hour, and it features 7 UN and NGO staff based in Nairobi who share their lived experiences alongside experts, testimonies from Professor Lukuya Dwoli, who's a psychiatrist at Aga Khan University in Nairobi, and Rasna Bara, who is a Kenyan writer and journalist and former UN employee. And so this documentary was very much based on ethical storytelling. And what I'm going to show you, obviously we don't have time to watch the whole movie, but I want to show you the entrance scene of that film, which features an excerpt of the interview I did with Rasna.
When you do experience racism, or when you realize you experience racism, either direct or indirect racism, it can be a traumatic experience because you believe that you're working in an organization that promotes human rights, that is egalitarian, that believes in equality, that wants to remove all forms of discrimination from the planet. And then when that very organization perpetuates the same injustices, the same discrimination, then it's a shock to the system.
So as I said before, we have 9 people featured in the film, and these are just tiny excerpts from parts of the interviews I conducted with them. And so they brought a whole lot of different themes to the film. So you can see people spoke about bias, implicit bias. Of course, then the intersection of racism and mental health, the manifestations of racism in the workplace, intersectionality, but also coping. How did they cope? And a whole lot of resilience. And that was very important to me also to show cases of situations where staff who experienced discrimination very powerfully shared what they have done to address that and to, make sure they are doing well and they feel well afterwards. Now, I would like to speak a little bit about impact. As you know, in academia, the currency are papers and citations. And there's no doubt that writing papers is absolutely important. And nevertheless, I think especially depending on what you research, we might have to go beyond that. So in my case, I'm focusing on social justice research. And I think there's a strong moral obligation to make sure that the results that we have are being made widely available in a way and in a medium that is meaningful to the populations that we study. And so this movie took way more time and effort than any paper I've ever written. And yet Charité does not accept it as an academic output, and it does not count toward my habilitation here. And so I think it's also, important for us as academics to rethink a little bit how we measure impact and what impact actually means for us. Because I do know that this film has reached way more humanitarian workers in a way that a paper never could, because I also do know that most people in the sector do not read the papers my colleagues and I keep publishing. And you can see here a quote of a staff member from Doctors Without Borders who came talk to me after he watched the film and said, well, I wouldn't have read the paper, and I'm thankful you chose this way of publishing. To communicate science nowadays, we need to find different ways to actually change things. Now, we made this documentary publicly available about half a year ago, and it's a website where you find all the information, the background on the research project. Everyone is listed who has contributed to the film, the publications that are based on this research project. And you can see that in these last 6 months, between 1,600 and 2,600 people are estimated to have visited that website. And if you then want to see the entire film, you have to fill out a form. And so out of these 700 plus people who filled out a form, we can see that most of them actually worked for NGOs and the UN, meaning we're reaching exactly the target group that we want to reach. And we can also see that quite a lot of people watch the film in groups, especially also in the context of a workplace. So again, the film is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Now, here you can say that the people who visited the website are coming from across continents. That's, of course, also very important in the context of global mental health, which is my field of work, to make sure there's international interest and global reach. And then in addition to this website, we had official screening events. And so you can see that major humanitarian players like Doctors Without Borders, the WHO headquarters in Geneva, also the Center for International Peace Operations here in Berlin, all of them have organized screening events for their staff. And at each event, there were between 10 and 200 people, depending on the organization and the size of the event. And usually this included a Q&A session with me afterwards, or a panel discussion, or some sort of interaction with the audience. It's also entered 3 film festivals, and I'm really happy to say that just 2 weeks ago, it won the Glora Prize for exceptional contributions in global health research. And so for next year, thanks. And so for next year, I'm actually really excited because we are scheduled to also show it at 2 major humanitarian conferences. So again, that's exactly where it should be. Now, after some of these official screenings, I asked people to describe in one word in an anonymous Mentimeter survey what their reaction is to the film. And you see the words in larger font are the words that were most frequently mentioned. So you can see people think it's important, it's insightful, it's eye-opening, it's thoughtful. It's also sad, moving. Some people find it very worrisome or frustrating. And again, I've never heard anyone reacting in that way to any paper I've written. So, and again, it's not surprising because if you engage people, in addition to a written text with visuals, you have sound, you have music, film music. People are emotionally more engaged. And in the context of such research, that matters because if people are more emotionally engaged, typically the likelihood of behavioral change is higher. Now, film obviously is an extremely collaborative form of art. So I really want to also acknowledge the many professionals who have given their time and their expertise to produce this film. Many of them actually way more beyond what I was able to pay them. And of course, also the interviewees who shared their lived experiences and personal stories for the greater good, which really is not an easy thing to do. And so I want to close this presentation with the words of an NGO worker in Nairobi who requested to stay anonymous in the film. And what you will see is the closing scene of the film.
It's still that define color. It doesn't define okay. It doesn't define anything. It doesn't even define beauty. So mine would define my intrinsic capacity or examination abilities. So if we can work together as one, it is my hope and my belief that that can enable humanitarian scholars to reach so many people, to save so many lives, and probably like they have a peaceful society at the end of the day.
Okay, and I obviously invite you to take these words to heart. And thanks again for being here and for your attention.
Test. Can you all hear me? Okay, cool. Okay. All right, y'all. Hello. Thank you all for making the trek out on such a warm evening. My name's Dan Miller. I am an entrepreneur, an innovator, designer. Most recently, was the founder and CEO of Spora Health. And I've been recently very inspired by the late, great Virgil Abloh. And so I'm going to go through many slides today really quickly in the hopes that I can offer some cheat codes of how we thought about some of the design decisions that we made, whether it was designing actual products and services or making clinical decisions. And yeah, I'm going to try to show more than tell y'all. So first, there was a good introduction earlier. I'm not going to say too much about these things on the slide besides this one point. Spora Health, which I'll get to, ended up being a primary care service that we offered virtually for communities of color across the United States. And I came to the realization that I wanted to start this back in November of 2019. That was my third company that I started. My second was a healthcare company in mental health, so a virtual telemedicine practice in mental health. And I knew that I wanted to start another company, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do. And I was really sitting and meditating a lot on my own lived experience, the lived experience of my loved ones. And I kept coming back to inequities and disparities. And so I really, taking my own lived experience and lived experience of my loved ones, kept coming back to this sort of understanding and reality, ultimately, that inequities and disparities are products of design. Unfortunately, sometimes explicit. Most of the time in the United States, they're quite implicit just because they're just an afterthought. And so we arrived at Spora Health, which I mentioned is primary care for people of color. And the problem, as bluntly as I can put it, is that in America, being Black is bad for your health. And there is really no hyperbole in that sentence. There are significant health inequities that I'm sure y'all are well aware of, but just to name them, that impact communities of color in the US. Significant socioeconomic determinants of health. And these things show up mostly race-based in the US. There is some a sort of degree of these things showing up across socioeconomic status, but really in a racialized society like the United States, these things show up in impacting certain races versus others. And the root is empirically racism. And I'm not going to go into too many stats, but one that really jumps out to me is like a true inequity is the second bullet point here around Black women being less likely to have breast cancer than white women in the US, but 40% more likely to die from the disease. Was a true inequity in terms of the care that they're getting relative to the rate of diagnosis in relation to other populations. And so I was sitting with myself alone, meditating a lot before I had a team, to think about this design question. How might we design an equitable primary care system, or practice at least? And for me, I arrived at understanding that, which I just mentioned, that inequities are products of design. And I wanted to push forward this sort of framework of thinking about products from patient-centered care to culture-centered care, which, just to put a definition on it, when we say culture-centered care, we mean putting the culture of the communities that we serve at the center of everything we do. Patient-centered care, doing the same thing, but just putting patients at the center of everything they do, which made sense 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when these sort of online systems were being designed, but it created some significant gaps in terms of how approachable a lot of these services were, and also just how individual communities sort of felt when they were interacting with some of these systems and these providers. And so this was a good framework to help guide myself and my thinking, but also my team's thinking about what's our North Star? How do we make decisions? What do we say yes to relative to versus saying no? And I'll go into detail about how we ended up sort of arriving at some of the outcomes that you see here, sort of from a visual perspective. But as you can see, this doesn't really look like much of a healthcare app. It's not teal or blue or white. And in terms of some of the information that we have here, it's quite different from a lot of the healthcare apps that you see out today. And this was it was a hypothesis back in early 2020, but I mean, got very, very lucky. There was never a better time in history to start a company like this than 2020. And it ended up working. And so I have a testimonial here from one of our patients, which, this is just like makes the experience extremely fulfilling. But she said, I have a lot of anxiety around the medical industry due to past experiences. I feel so fortunate to have found this provider and Spora Health. She is compassionate, knowledgeable, and down to earth. One of our clinical employees is also wonderful and easily accessible. This has been my best experience seeking medical care. And I want to take a step back a bit from sort of the end state that you saw there, and some of the testimonials from the experience that our patients had. Back to why we sort of arrived at integrating art and design and looking at that as a a tool to sort of design better experiences. The first was, again, this was a hypothesis, it was a guess, but like, I thought that if we could make something that was a bit more culturally aligned with the communities that we're serving, not just in terms of the language, but the branding, what was included from a clinical perspective, the things that we were solving, how we talked about them, where we showed up in the world and with whom, that at a minimum, we could increase the approachability of healthcare. We could get more folks sort of accessing care, which is a huge issue for our community, at a maximum that we could save lives. And this was something that's empirically backed up as well, and that's thinking about incorporating easy to use solutions, which is like, in hindsight, these things are 2020, frankly. And like the healthcare industry, especially in the US, has a lot of catching up to do. But these things work because they help folks feel more trustworthy in the solutions that they're using. They feel like they can actually understand what's happening. So health literacy scores tend to go up as well. And because health literacy scores go up, there's a good correlation to more medical adherence and compliance as well downstream. Minute long, showing y'all sort of how this showed up and how we showed up in the world in different ways.
Healthcare is not equitable. We are tired of doctors who misdiagnose us, doctors who don't really see us, doctors who don't understand us. It's time for a revolution. Spora Health is a case where rapidly losing healthcare happens. Spora Health is primary care for people of color. Spora is the solution to tackling your health goals. And we'll be there with you every step of the way. Spora is available 24/7 and provides a holistic health approach, effortless assessments, and tailor-made care, all for the price of $9.99 a month. The Spora app is a personalized, all-in-one tool, helping members in partnership with their provider to understand where they are in their health journey and how to get to where they want to go. So sign up today at SporaHealth.com to experience a different kind of care. Because feeling better should feel good.
Cool. And the next one. Oh, no, sorry. Back to the website. Next one. Let's bring this. So that was a commercial that we shot just to introduce the brand and the health service in a different way to folks, which ended up working extremely well. And now we have we launched a maternity care pathway called Spora Mamas, where we supported mothers throughout their entire pregnancy through the 4th trimester. We sent devices in home. I'll show some photos of these physical things later. And we paired folks with doulas. We had one-on-one doula sessions every week. Every other week, they connected with what we call a bump group. So folks that are in the same gestational age would get together every other week and talk about what was happening in their bodies and throughout the pregnancy. And that was all guided by the doula. And we needed to, this didn't exist before we created it. This was back in late 2021. And so this was a sort of, we wanted to fill, there's a gap between OB-GYNs in the US and doulas. And OB-GYNs are definitely overwhelmed with the amount of patients. And so they tend to have very short visits with folks. But also like to address the maternal mortality and morbidity rates in the US, there's quite a bit that could be done virtually just by helping folks get access to remote patient monitoring devices and then access to a doula. And so that was enough sort of impetus for us to want to invest in creating this sort of solution. That was a demo, but that ended up being exactly what the product looked like. But I just wanted to show a bit around how some of these earlier hypotheses and so decisions ended up showing up in the product. Yeah. Cool. And as I mentioned, all this really started by focusing on the culture of the folks that we served. And so we did extensive research into our community that we wanted to speak to. And these are like copied and pasted from a 60-page brand guideline that we created, which you don't typically see in healthcare companies. But for us, it was really important to understand what made our community tick, how these folks made decisions. We had some sort of lived experience on the founding team, but really wanted to get out into the field and better understand how folks are thinking about their own health and wellness and what would make them excited about actually going to the doctor. So really quickly, some things here. Folks were really focused on actionable outcomes. There's a long history in the United States of sort of paternalism that exists from medical professionals, especially in relation to how they treat communities of color. And so folks have, trust is a huge thing. And so thinking about not just showing statistics, but being very warm and upfront with how we were introducing care to them and building trust upfront was something that was important. And just to give you a quick sort of example of that, anyone could have gone to sporahealth.com and we have a machine learning assessment to folks better understand their risk profile for different chronic conditions. And why that's important is particularly for communities of color, there are higher rates of diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, things like CKD, chronic kidney disease, et cetera. And so we created this technology that's a simple questionnaire, and then we gave that away for free. We wanted folks to have an understanding of what was happening in their bodies. And if they wanted to come to Spora to have a conversation with one of our doctors, that was great, that was ideal. But if not, that's fine. But we wanted to show up in the world in a way where we were giving something first before asking people to give us their data or sign up for something. It was a small gesture, but it ended up going a long way for having, I mean, this is now sort of technical, but like we had a very high conversion rate from folks that just landed on the landing page that were potential patients to actually booking an initial visit. And this extended into the way that we showed up in the world and how we talked about the company as well. And typically, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, these brands are quite paternalistic in their language. And so folks tend to get talked down to. And we wanted to try to come down to a level, a sort of a plane to have a conversation. And this might be a shock to some of you maybe know, but like the average reading level in the United States is, it may have changed, but it's at like roughly like a 7th grade level, 7th or 8th grade level, which is sad, but like, but it is what it is. And so we had to think differently about lowering the language in a way that was approachable. If we were speaking to doctors, obviously it would be in a sort of level, but like speaking to the general population, we had to reframe how we talked about certain topics like chronic conditions or just accessing doctors, what to expect, these sorts of things. But it ended up working really well in creating not just a sticky sort of experience, but something that was pretty enjoyable. I'm going to speed up a little bit here, showing you a little bit about like how this sort of approach to designing care showed up in a visual sense. We wanted to definitely pay homage to the roots of the people that we were serving from a color palette perspective, but also wanted to break these rules a bit. And so we often broke the grid almost all the time, actually, like, and introduce sort of new shapes and ideas in a healthcare company. Cool. And so this is the maternity program called Spora Mamas. And as I mentioned, it didn't exist before we created it. And typically these sorts of products, any product sort of designed by a healthcare company that's sort of deployed in home would typically look very, I don't know, sterile and look like a laboratory made it. And so I really focused on trying to make this a piece of art, something that folks would feel proud to sort of have out in their home, and to the best of our ability, try to make this a beautiful, sort of enjoyable experience. And so our mamas would get sent this kit in the mail. So they would open it up and actually get this experience. And then inside would be all of the remote patient monitoring devices that you see on the left here. We invented this sort of like kickstand thing for folks to lean their phone up against, so they could actually be guided with a doula to how to use the blood pressure cuff or a pulse oximeter, as well as a journal for folks to track their sort of mental health and any sort of nuggets throughout their entire pregnancy. And this ended up winning a few awards, but it won a design award from Core 77. It's an international sort of industrial design contest. I think it looks pretty good. And here are some of the outcomes. Over the first year, we had over 100 healthy births. Thankfully, no mortalities, babies or mothers. We lowered morbidity rates as well, significantly. Folks were tracking their vitals on average about 3 times a week. Mothers still use our remote patient monitoring devices now and use the app even after their pregnancy. So this was something that was extremely fulfilling and worked very well, and it all stemmed from sort of thinking about how we design healthcare experiences for the culture of the folks that we're serving. And that extended to some of the research that we present as well. And I'm going to wrap because I am over time. Thank you. Actually, I might. Yeah,
Mike?
Yeah.
Take a seat. Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Danny. I think we opened up a whole nother field today with your 2 presentations that connected very well, I think. And I really appreciate that we have now, in this context of the healing arts and the encounters of art and medicine, and let's say unconventional academic and an unconventional entrepreneurial approach to the whole issue. In particular, with the questions of what you called actionable outcomes as an entrepreneur, but also for you, actionable outcomes as an academic, a researcher who uses a different type of tool or different type of approach. And both of you have very clearly used creative methods in doing so, film, design, etc. So, first of all, congratulations to doing that, and because that's also a daring move. And it kind of showed, I think you said something, that inequities and disparities are products of design, no? Which can be translated to all the other fields there as well. But by using such a deliberate design approach through the medium of film or actually product design, you also both address the approachability and the accessibility and accessibility of research, of information, and for you of the products there. What have been your biggest learnings in this process, for the good and for the bad?
I'll give a philosophical answer first and then a sort of like tactical answer. I think philosophically, it was in my personal experience, I tend to be quite heady, and definitely, before 2019, sort of experienced the world a lot through my mind and analyzing the world in that way. But what changed for me over the last 5 years was incorporating my gut a bit more and thinking about incorporating my intuition and trusting the sort of tacit knowledge that I had sort of developed over time, and that I could make quick decisions using intuition and factoring that in, that could guide me in the right direction, which previously I wouldn't have. I would have sort of discounted that, and so that was a learning for me. But also, I think something that was quite interesting was co-building. This was the first time that I had really spent a lot of time and energy and money, frankly, into involving the community while we were designing new products. So very much so in the research, the formal sort of research phase, quantitative and qualitative, yeah. But also as we were building products, making sure that we're getting these things in front of potential patients or current patients to get their feedback. And this helped us, just find sort of blind spots very, very quickly.
So for me, I had a couple of lessons, but one that stands out to me and that actually also matters a lot to me is you've noticed I'm very critical of academia. And so in making this film, I stepped out of our normal turf, if you wish. And interestingly, though, this stepping out kind of brought me back to enjoying research more and also the power that academia has, because I know that a lot of the people featured in this film agreed to take part in it because I'm an academic and because their statements were embedded in a scientific project with additional data and knowledge incorporated into the film. And whatever we do, it goes through an ethical approval committee prior to us going out and asking people questions. And that instilled quite a lot of trust and confidence in people to then come and talk to me. So while being critical of certain parts of academia, again, doing this other thing highlighted once more for me personally the power that we can have by doing such kind of research projects. So that was one big lesson. Another thing that I was surprised about, very positively surprised about, was the openness that once this film was there, people in the academic world, as well as the humanitarian world, were suddenly very open to show this film and to disseminate that. And that is something that is, especially for a large organization, very untypical, to take data or products produced outside and bring it internally and use it as advocacy or awareness-raising tools. And again, I'm almost certain it had a lot to do with that being a research project and me coming and saying, well, this is backed up by all of these interviews that I've conducted. It's not individual cases. This is what we've seen large scale.
That's a very interesting point that you just made. Also how academia kind of opened the door for you, that people actually felt more comfortable to talk. But at the same time, you described to us earlier that going back to academia, it's not being accredited, like literally.
So,
which is a topic that we had a couple of times before, where it's like, why are certain things accredited and others are not?
Absolutely, and I think it's a big problem in academia that, so now the film is being shown and I win academic awards, but my own institution doesn't count it towards my academic progress. And so in essence, what I have in this film is makes data for about 3 papers or so. And so I'm easily a year behind. And we don't have many incentives these days for academics to engage in such type of outlets other than moral obligation, ethical commitment, personal, I don't know. So, and I think that's definitely something that has to change.
And can we just brainstorm together? Like, what are actual, pragmatically speaking, structural systemic shifts that would need to occur? In a way, also what we're doing here. I mean, last 2 times we had here witchcraft and shamanism at the Charité. So, and you're still getting credit points here if you're a medical student. So we are already subversively pushing a little bit the boundaries, but
which is good. So, I mean, what's definitely needed, and that's also a flaw in the system, if you ask me personally, it's a very hierarchical system we are operating in, right? So if I go and ask, will you recognize that? I get, this is recorded, right?
yes.
So But it goes very quickly that this is a no. So it needs people in more powerful positions than me. I'm a postdoc, to bring this conversation forward. And that's also part of the problem, right? That it's a very hierarchical structure where only people in certain power positions, not only, but most of the time, it's people who already are in seats of power are being listened to.
And maybe to you, Danny, you spoke about culture-centered care, parallel to, additionally to, complementary to patient-centered care. How can this kind of culture-centered care move from theory to practice in meaningful ways?
From my experience, I think there were two major sort of decisions that had incredible sort of outcomes. The first was just having the awareness of shifting the mindset to something that was a bit more local to the community that we wanted to serve. And it's not just, we could say patient-centered care or like something analogous to patient, but like it's sort that then discounts the reality of a lot of Americans that are in marginalized positions and their experiences when they interact with the healthcare system and how they make healthcare decisions. And so just that I know it sounds small, but just like the reframing of thinking about how we're going to design services was incredible. And so I would urge, whether it's like that language or, you can fill it in with like community center care or something on these lines, like these small changes, which seem sort of small, they end up really having, they can have significant impact if from the top down decisions are being made through these frames. And then I'd say the second decision, which I already mentioned, but it is the answer to your question, is involving folks from the community. It is trying to get out of this paternalistic mindset that most certainly exists amongst healthcare professionals in the United States, most certainly doctors. But it then sort of trickles down into the healthcare system that folks that are building these systems or these practices know better than the patients. And that is very much true in certain cases. But also when we're thinking about how healthcare decisions are being made, what's best for one patient versus the other, that's a conversation. And then the person in the community and how they're making decisions needs to be accounted for. And so I think the real answer is that co-design sort of component as well. And so making sure that for, whatever the community is, or if it's a certain population, like an elderly population, et cetera, that experiences and services are, this particular sort of user group is being included while these things are being created. So that they have some say, but also so that you're not sort of, that folks aren't designing things in an ivory tower and that their own sort of implicit biases or explicit biases are showing up solely into what's being created.
And now on a personal note, and then you guys can get ready with your questions. Since both of you come with great projects, but what brought you to this whole topic of healthcare? Like, why are you doing what you're doing on a very personal, biographical level?
I don't know which came first, but whether I'm the eldest of three, so I was an only child for about 10 years. But I also like to solve my own problems. And I don't know if I personally just like to solve my own problems, and that would have always been the case, or if I was because I was alone for 10 years and had to make do by myself. But I like to solve my own problems. And my first healthcare venture, which I mentioned, was a virtual telemedicine practice in mental health. And the story there is that I was 27. my first company was in music and it didn't go well. And I worked on it for too long. I spent all my money, and for the first time in my life was experiencing diagnosable anxiety. And I had no idea what was happening. And I ended up going to, I went to the internet to solve my problems, as a technologist does. And then a friend of mine had she's a therapist. She had a mental health app. I used hers, had a really off-putting experience, left the experience feeling more like a number than a person. And I was like, there's got to be something better than this. And instead of finding another therapist, I started a company. And so that was my introduction to healthcare, was wanting to solve my own problems, but also realizing, as someone that is a sort of designer and entrepreneur, that I feel like if you see something that could be fixed and you have the ability to fix it, I think there's a sort of moral obligation to try to do it if you can. Yeah, and that's how I was showing up in the world then and how I continue to now.
Thanks.
So for me, I started off with something very different. I studied literature, art and media as my undergrad degree, and then moved on to comparative and international studies. And then I started to work for the UN, which is really what I wanted to do from a very young age onwards. And so I worked in Thailand for a couple of years, and then in New York for the UN headquarters. And throughout these years, I kept noticing, well, we're implementing all of these very important development humanitarian projects. And there's many factors that contribute whether these projects are working well or effective or not. And one also has to define that carefully. But one key thing is, if people who receive aid are not in a position to participate in the project, for example, due to being severely depressed or experiencing malaria, other diseases, the project can be brilliant, but it's just not going to work the way it's intended to work. And so that was the point where I wanted to learn more about health, originally with the objective to mainstream health and all of these other projects that I was engaged in, mainly connected to environment and gender. So I came to Charité and did a second master's in international health, but I kept doing consulting work for the UN. And so towards the end of my master's, I got a contract in South Sudan. So I spent 6-7 months working for the UN in South Sudan. And that's probably, it's a crisis context. And so I had a really, in quotation marks, good contract in terms of I could come and go quite frequently, but I had a lot of colleagues on site who could not leave, either because they were South Sudanese and hired on national contracts, or because they were on an international contract, but for an organization that didn't support them coming and going as much as they had needed to. And so that's then where the shift internally to the organization came about. So I saw a lot of my colleagues experiencing all sorts of mental health problems. And I looked at the literature and I realized there's not much out there on that at all. So I thought, okay, that's my PhD. And then I stayed with it.
Actually beautiful, because it's a topic that came up here a few times, if you guys remember, how do we care for the caregivers? No, in an environment that valorizes self-sacrifice and resilience actually over, your own well-being. No, if you remember, this was addressed in almost all of the sessions. Thank you for your work.
Thank you too so much. That was super interesting what you both shared. We're self-introducing, right? Okay, I'm Roja. I'm a product design student at UDK Berlin, and I'm doing my bachelor's project about giving better care to patients in the entrance of hospitals, in the entrance area. I'd two questions or different questions for each of you, because I found it really interesting, and I think if it's possible, I would like you to share even more about the projects you work on. For Hannah, I wondered, What was the filming process like, and also the trust building? Now you shared that you also worked for the UN, so you probably already had contacts, but how did it work convincing people doing such an unconventional project also in academics? And then also for Danny, I wondered, could you share more about your experience co-building the Spora Health, and like more insights, and how did you go about it? What were your like surprises also? What did not work well? Yeah, or what worked well too? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so working for the UN and also NGOs definitely made things much easier because I know the system so well. And it's a very complex system to understand if you don't know how the inside of it looks like. So coming with this knowledge, I think helped a lot because people feel then they can tell you in their own jargon what's going on without having to translate it to someone who doesn't exactly know how these structures work. Also coming with a very strong personal and professional network is super helpful. So and it's snowball sampling. That's the sampling method that typically is used in projects like that. Or it's one option of many, but one that's quite common, where you start off with your network with people who you know. And you would, tell them, okay, this is what I'm doing. This is my research project. Do you know people who might be interested in participating? And so please, inform them. They can reach out to me. And so you go from one to the next to the next. And then in terms of, I didn't have many challenges finding participants to speak to me outside the film. But then recruiting for the film, I thought I had a lot of respect for that. I was, to be really frank with you, I was worried. I thought I said I make a film. Who's going to participate? But truth be told, almost everyone who I asked agreed to speak. And I think parts of it is, I think we live in an era where people aren't so shy anymore in front of a camera, and not everyone. I'm very shy in front of a camera, but a lot of people feel fairly comfortable with that. But it also opened up an opportunity for them to tell their story and to share their concerns and also their anger, and but also what went well. So it wasn't all that hard to then find people to also share their story in front of a camera.
So I'll try to answer the sort of building question across time, going back from like 2019 to like, maybe 2022 was the last time we sort of launched something. But in the early days, it's really started by, like I said, me listening to my own lived experience and my loved ones. That was the first time I really sort of got some anecdotal like insights from family members about what their experience was like interacting with the healthcare system, which like just doesn't come up in conversation typically. And so like I learned my mom had a particularly trying pregnancy with one of my younger brothers, and in which she wasn't feeling listened to by her doctor. And it was quite trying for her. And then I sort of tried to zoom out and increase the sample size, obviously. And then so like I then was able to participate in a corporate wellness fair. So I live in Berlin now, but I used to live in San Francisco for 15 years. And so I had a friend that was putting on a sort of wellness fair at Twitter at the time. And she's a Black woman. And so we collaborated on finding these amazing practitioners. It was for Black History Month. We got some amazing practitioners from the area and brought them in. Doctors, therapists, but folks, there was like a guy that led sort of Qigong there. Like both of us led a guided meditation. Like it was really cool, but that was also an experiment. And so while I was there, I was getting qualitative or quantitative feedback. So like I sent a survey out to everyone that that attended. But also while I was there, I was just sort of asking folks about how they made decisions. That statistic in the commercial about like how they would feel about race concordant care, or like, the ethnicity or race between the provider and them being the same, and if they've had sort of negative experiences. And these are, I think these are, they're important sort of questions to ask in the context and in the environment. And so like, I think they're important questions to ask and considerations because folks typically don't have these experiences, especially communities of color. And typically there's a lack of sort of trust and comfortability. I didn't go into a lot of the history, but I'll give a clear sort of example. I think it was like, forgive me on the year, but it's definitely 19th century. There was something called the Tuskegee experiment, which I'm not sure if it's studied outside of the US, but for folks, really quickly, the US government was doing a study on Black males in the South, and they told them that it was for one thing, but in reality, they were giving them syphilis and then tracking the effects of syphilis on people. And like, for obvious reasons, like people now, from this community don't trust the healthcare system largely. I mean, that's changed over time, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to build that trust. And so I mentioned that example because like these questions, I think, they're important in the context and in the environments in the US. And so that was something that worked well. And then ultimately getting to a place where we had signal that inequities were something that were obviously impacting patients from engaging, but also on the provider side, folks weren't trained well at all. So health equity sort of showed up in a theoretical sense in med school, and it's typically only one class and doesn't show up in residency. And so providers aren't really prepared well in terms of given actionable skills for how to think about what equitable care looks like for someone, what it sounds like. And so I learned that we ended up creating an actual curriculum for doctors, and we ended up getting a continuing education accreditation, so it was legit. But then also on the patient side, we continue to just involve them in quantitative and qualitative research very early on. But as we got any sort of MVP, any sort of like small testable portion of the product or service, we got it in their hands. And there were certain aspects of the business that we could move very quickly and test things. Things on the clinical side of the business, we took our time, and like those things didn't change all that much besides the training. But on the patient side, we wanted to be as innovative with their experience as possible. And so that was, traditional sort of quick sort of flywheel cycle to get things out into their hands to get their feedback.
Before we come to the next question, as a first my experience of walking through the room, it's very hot up there. So I highly recommend we do a little embodied practice like last time. We all find a new position right now. So find a new spot, and I give a recommendation. Start from this row and nothing above, because it's definitely hotter up there. So the further you go down, the cooler it gets. But find a new spot. That's good.
Should we move?
Yeah, you can also sit. Come all the way down. Come all the way. Let's make it all cozy here.
So maybe as you're finding your new seat, one tiny addition to the question that just came. Everyone involved or shown in this film has seen a rough cut and the final cut before it went public. I think that's maybe an important addition to be made, yeah.
We have another question.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Georg, I'm a medical student here at Charité. And but I first wanted to thank you both for your presentations. It was very interesting to see what you're working on and to see listen about your projects, especially as both of them are kind of bridging domains, let's say. And this is something that is very, very hard, I think, very important, very interesting also. But also a bit dangerous, I think, sometimes. And that's a bit what my question is about, because, I mean, this whole lecture series here is about bridging two worlds that are often considered to be quite distinct. We are here to experience that they're not, which is something very beautiful to do. And I'm very happy that I can do that here. But still, I think it's important to sometimes also remember that the fact that certain things are separated in the way that they are lived, or in the institutional ways that they exist in society, and also the way that are separated in the way we think about them, that this also has a meaning, or that this is also important on the other side. And then by mixing them, sometimes also, I mean, it becomes a mix that's kind of part of the game. And so regarding your film, I was like, I mean, what you and the question, like the discussion we had about academia, how to recognize this project and how to think about this. So I mean, the presentation you gave, and I think also the film, like from what you showed, from what you showed us, it's not a scientific presentation, like in the quantitative sense of like how we think about science as being quantitative and everything. I looked in some of your papers, they look very differently. And so this is also what you said, that of course the idea was to get outside of that, to reach another, to reach other people. But still, I think it's important to keep these two worlds also kind of apart, because they serve different purposes. I mean, how to say, I mean, to have, I don't know how many people speak in your film, but I mean, in your survey, there are like 1,200. So I assume that there are less than 1,200 people speaking in your film. So of course, it's not representative. It cannot be. It's qualitative research. So by definition, it's a different thing. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, and to how to say, like to really foster the strengths of both of these worlds. And yeah, and I mean, it's the same thing for your project, I think, with the health, with the product you designed. That I mean, it's also from what I saw, it's also far from being like a scientific instrument. I mean, basically, you're selling a product at the end of the day. So it serves a specific purpose, and yeah. So also, I mean, I don't know what's all part of this, also from a privacy point of view. Like, I don't know how you handle the data of your patients, for example. I think it's good also to separate this, like that there are national, like state institutions that handle these things differently and that work in a different way. So I just wanted to challenge a bit this point of view and ask you how this bridging, how you experience this danger that I just tried to describe briefly, a bit of keeping things apart and like mixing them and keeping them apart at the same time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I appreciate your comments and challenging, my stance. A few thoughts here. So first of all, yes, I published quantitative studies a few times. I also published qualitatively, which is a very different way of working. And sometimes we publish qualitative studies with as little as 5 people, 10 people, depending on the design. And again, here the point is not generalizability of data. It's a very different approach, qualitative research. Now, having said that, I think my point was saying that we need to be more open, or that I wish academia was more open to alternative formats, is not to say, oh, I'm only going to produce films now at a university hospital, and so with that, I'm going to become a professor or a Privatdozent or whatever. No. But the point is, there's so many things you have to deliver. And can't we say, well, out of the 10 papers, that's the rule at Charité, as first or last author? And it doesn't even matter. It could be a tiny journal in Germany, which no one in the population I study ever reads, but that would be acknowledged. That would be recognized. But this film isn't. But if I sit down now and write a paper about this film, that again would count. So isn't that a little bit absurd in one way or another? I personally think so. And again, it's not about saying you don't have to write. And I said that in my presentation very clearly. There's no doubt that writing papers is important. That's our currency. And I'm absolutely in that with you. But the question is this enough? Can it be the only thing, especially when we talk about global health, when we talk about social justice research, I'm using tax money for, and then I produce for another academic who might cite or not cite my paper, but the people who I'm researching, who volunteer their time and who should actually benefit from that, don't have access, or it's written in a way they don't consume. So I ask you, this is my criticism. And I think here again, you can't expect an academic to just say, okay, fine, I'm using all of my free time unpaid to produce an extra product that actually, is of meaning for the population I study. No, that's not right. I'm getting passionate here. So yeah, I leave it at that.
Thank you for the question. I think I understand theoretically where your question is coming from, and I'll give you a few different answers, but I also don't agree with the premise. And the reason is we like Spora Health often sort of got this sort of feedback because the facade looks a specific sort of way, that it was that it wasn't evidence-based because it looked so different. Folks thought that we put a sort of overemphasis on that and that there wasn't a sort of clinical foundation in the work that we were doing, that's far from the truth. I mean, I went through this pretty quickly and didn't dive into numbers, but like could very well go into the outcomes and the experiences of our patients. And so across all three products that we have, so the training with all of our doctors, we published research with Columbia. We were empirically making our doctors more culturally competent in providing care for underserved, marginalized populations, which like this sort of care, I mean, this sort of training didn't exist previously. And then also that product, which again, back to the premise of your question, I would very much say that like healthcare, whether it's state produced or otherwise, is still a product. There's still an experience. There's still that's just a frame of sort of mindset of the sort of modality that's being sort of used at the time. But for us, that training for our doctors had an 86 NPS score, which is world-class. The maternity program, which you saw the outcomes, we decreased morbidity rates, mortality rates as well, relative to that population that had 100 NPS score, and these are all statistically significant numbers. And the industry standards are roughly anywhere between 0 and 30 for these sorts of products. And so there's very much there was a strong evidence-based foundation, but what was different was that we knew that we needed to design something on top of that was a bit more addressable for folks. And so like I think if sort of the status quo was working, then we wouldn't be able to produce these sort of outcomes. So going back to sort of the premise of your question, like if these things weren't needed, then the sort of problem would be solved and we wouldn't have inequities and disparities to begin with, but we do. And so there needs to be different ways of thinking about how to solve these sorts of challenges and these problems. And this is like just one from my small team and like the 5 years that we worked on this. But like, I want everyone to this is just a data point of how I thought that we should show up in the world to try to address these problems. And I want other folks to have the courage and the mindset to think about these things and either creating their own systems or leveraging learnings that we did.
Before I pass the mic to the next question, Thank you for your question, though. And I think really important, I just thought about it, is here in this context is the solution is never on the same level as the problem. So problem level and solution level are not the same. And that's a really important one to kind of think about. So we're aware, and that's after each session here, there is a systemic, a structural problem. The solution will not be found on that level of the problem. It's another level. And that's something to always keep in mind. But now to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Vladimir, a PhD candidate at the Charité. To Hannah, I was at Gloria Day, so congratulations again. It's heartening to see somebody sort of breaking the mold of academia to highlight human stories and not just statistics. But my questions are actually to Danny. 3 mini questions. One is, how does your app relate to sort of insurance schemes? You know, are you targeting those who are already insured or uninsured? How does that link up to downstream care, which you might need to refer to? Secondly is, do you make specific efforts to recruit, for example, African-American providers, you know, doulas, GPs, family doctors, etc., because we know that patients do trust professionals who are from their cultural or ethnic background. And third is, how do you see your app being positioned on the sort of healthcare app landscape? You know, we see many healthcare apps out there. How do you sort of, or are there any competitors that you have? Are you also competing with, for example, you know, the $9.99, you know, Netflix or Disney Plus, you know, and because, you know, are you targeting the worried well, or are there people who are truly in need who do subscribe to, for example, your service? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to go in a different order than you asked them. I'll answer the second question first. So no, we don't target providers of color. I contrary to what you might believe, like I don't think just race concordant care solves the problem. It is something that is valuable over a certain time period. I don't know what that time period will be, but once we have a larger supply of more culturally competent providers in aggregate, I think we'll better be able to provide culturally competent care for different providers. I think race concordant care is there's a sort of premium on that, and it's over indexed in terms of conversation and focal point in some clinical practices, because there's such a lack of supply of providers of color, but also just the training, which I mentioned. Once more folks are trained on how to serve different communities, then that sort of argument sort of decreases significantly, I think. I guess I diluted it significantly. So yeah, that's the answer to your second question. The third question you asked, no, there weren't any competitors to us that provided training for doctors that had the actual sort of primary care GP app, as well as the maternity program. But very much so now, there have been a bunch of copy and paste sort of Spora Healths, which is great. Like there should be more competition, but also just, I mean, we scaled across the nation in the United States. It's a gigantic place, tons of regulation to consider on a state-by-state level, a lot of people, and no one company is going to solve this problem. And so like, this is why I still sort of do talks like this and share like everything that we've learned, is because like it's going to require this for things to really change on a macro scale. But I say and this, I'll sort of segue into your first question. We started with like a $10 per month fee just to give people access to care. And then even for like the first 3 months, we operated in Florida and I think Tennessee, and we didn't charge anyone. We were just giving away free sessions. Because like we needed to sort of test what we had built, the training of our doctors. So folks that needed urgent care appointments and primary care appointments, we just gave them away for free. But then thereafter, folks that were on really crappy health insurance plans typically have high deductibles, or they're uninsured. We needed to design something that was approachable for them. And just like we were just trying $10 per month, which was okay. It seemed to work well, and there was definitely a per appointment fee around $60, I believe, which is more affordable than you typically see for uninsured patients going direct to a doctor in the United States, which is roughly around $200. So now the insurance question. This is very like complex, but for most people in the United States are getting their health insurance from their employer. And so we ended up having to go, well, I made the decision to go towards partnering with employers. And then we also had contracts with these insurance companies as well. And they're like United Healthcare, Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield. These folks have like the GDPs of small countries on their balance sheets. It's like they're very, very large companies that move slow and are quite antiquated in how they think about care delivery. But we need to, because folks are either getting their care through their employer, or they have a direct sort of contract with the health insurance company. So we had this for folks that were uninsured or were on high deductible plans, they were underinsured. We created this $10 per month fee, and they paid us $60 whenever they wanted to have an appointment. For folks that were that work for large self-insured employers, like Apple, as an example, was one of our customers, or some other folks, like we would sell directly to Apple, and then all of Apple's employees would have access to Spora Health for free. And then the last bucket were folks that got their that had direct sort of relationships with these large insurance companies that I mentioned. And in those arrangements, those were just like any other doctor appointment. They would come to us, they would pay a copay, $10, $20, whatever it was. We would send the claim over to the insurance provider, and then we would get a reimbursement. We didn't get to Medicaid. Well, we did have some, yeah, it's complex. We didn't get to Medicaid, but we did have some fee-for-service Medicare Advantage plans. So we were able to support Medicare patients, but and for folks that aren't aware, those are the sort of the eldest populations in the US. Medicaid, some of the poorest folks in the US, and those plans are free and have to be state approved, and there's a long approval process. We didn't have any of those contracts just yet.
Thank you, Danny.
I also have a real quick question to Danny. I work in acute psychiatry at the moment doing my residency, and I often find myself recommending certain apps to certain age groups. But how do you think about the elderly in these communities? How do you reach them, or are there any ideas or people that are not keen on using apps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a great answer for you in terms of like how because they weren't our target market. And so we have folks that were up to in their 70s that had used the app. These things were like definitely considered to a certain perspective, but if we were designing solely for folks that were, let's say, 65 and above, the app would have looked very different. But that wasn't, that they weren't our target market. So although we did have folks that were in this sort of age range, I can't tell you that it was like the strongest consideration in design decisions that we made, because we were surveying folks that were between 18 and up to like 55, really. That was the band ultimately. So knew it was a problem. We tried to do our best from a, accessibility perspective, for sure, from like how it looked. But in fairness, like it would look much different if we were signing solely for these elderly populations too.
Follow-up question?
Hey, I have one more question. It's much more open, but I'm just interested in your perspective. I wonder, within your field, if you could change one thing about that field, what would it be to make this better? And then a follow-up question for each of you: if in utopia, then again, if you would have all resources and in any sense, how would this field ideally look like, or what would you wish we would in what direction should it go to better it, or to make it more fair and just? Yeah.
the big question.
So you mean how mental health in the workplace for people, what needs to be improved to make this better? Did I get your question correctly? Okay. So first of all, I think in the last 10 years, organizations started to pay much greater attention to the mental health and well-being of their staff. So that's already a really good development. And I think it's important to honor that. Now, having said this, there's still a lot of differences in access between so-called national staff and international staff. So national staff would be people recruited in the country where the operation is being delivered. And international staff are expatriates. And national staff usually there's huge pay gaps. There's unequal access to psychosocial care. And so this has been long criticized in the sector, and rightly so. So definitely we would have to, and that's something that I really hope will come in the years and in the near future, to provide more access, more equal access, more equitable access to support. And the second thing is that the way how we deliver support, staff support, is also, it's very centered on how we do things in the so-called global north. So again, there's places where the idea of sitting with someone in a closed room talking about depression, that's not what people would want to be doing or how they would understand support for themselves. So I think also here it's important to deliver or to have, to offer an array of services for people to choose from that's culturally sensitive, that's adaptable, and that's cost effective. And there's quite a few things that could be done. Peer support networks is one of them. Arts-based initiatives is another thing where we have increasingly more data on. In addition to, of course, specialized services, psychological care and psychiatric care. But so really focusing on this, on bridging this divide between national and international staff, which continues to persist, and that's not okay. Yeah.
So I think one thing that I would want to see change is just that more healthcare providers, less the individuals, more so the systems, the practices, even insurance companies, that they incorporate design thinking more, and just incorporate some product design for sure. That would go a long way. Sort of ideal utopia would be, that we start to integrate health equity in a sort of actionable way, and cultural competence and culture and community and the way that these sort of networks and systems guide the behaviors, decisions, and things that we have access to in our lives, how that can impact one's healthcare. And so this currently doesn't exist in, like I said, in med school still today, as I talk to you right now. Health equity training is recommended. It's not required, even though there are evidence-based solutions out there. There's at least 20 years worth of empirical research showing that these things are real and that they work. But the sort of governing body is a federal entity called CMS, and they recommend these things. It's not required. And so that needs to change for sure. And once that does change, then we'll start to see trickle-down effects, I think, that are positive. Chiefly, you'll start to see these sorts of courses show up in med schools and residency programs, and even further down into experiences and how things are measured in care delivery environments like hospitals and offices, et cetera, which again, right now, unless you're going to, a practice that's that cares about these things, or just chooses to incorporate that data, it doesn't exist. and then like saying that, reframing how I just answered that question is like believing that the status quo is like working for communities of color, but it's not. And so, yeah, more sort of consideration that these systems amongst us on a community and social level or can impact health outcomes significantly.
Yeah, may I connect to the questions of the colleague upstairs? I'm still impressed by the design of your product, the Mommers box, for example, yeah, as one of the products. My first question is, what do you think is the part of which role does the design play in the attractiveness of the whole program, and how much does the $10 fee, which is low, yeah, enhance the attractivity of the product? And if it is the design, and if the design really plays a role, I wonder, that's not a question, that's just an idea, whether this could be a means for us here too. We don't have a problem with uninsured people so much, but we have a large community of people who don't have as good access to healthcare offers as the well-educated, more rich people have. Especially in Berlin, we have large communities we cannot reach. But could we perhaps reach them by a really attractive design? Because this, gives them a feeling of luxury. So I'm not. I'm not cared for by the German word Mildtätigkeit, yeah, but it's done because I'm worthwhile, that someone gives effort into design and something like that. So this is what I wonder, if we could attract people by this means.
Yes, great questions. Great question. So the design aspect and this is like such a full circle moment being here in Germany, and like a lot of the sort of product designers like that are done really well, like have like a strong foundation in understanding sort of Bauhaus principles and these sorts of things. But like it's very much foundationally looking at the utility. But we learned in our research, especially with Spora Mamas, that a lot of there was never a product that sort of combined all the things that you saw, but folks would purchase sort of blood pressure cuffs, or their doctors would recommend that they buy a pulse oximeter or like a blood glucose monitor or something. And we learned in our research is that folks may use these things once and then they would go into a drawer or like, some storage area because they're ugly to look at, frankly. And they weren't well packaged, meaning like after you take them out of the outside of sort of packaging, that the consideration for what they look like in your home was rarely present. And so it was something that I thought should exist just because I wanted to create a sort of luxury experience for folks that were feeling sort of left out by the system, wanted to give them a premium experience. But it also had utility in that by designing something that was pleasant to look at, or designing something that at least was not ugly to look at, I believe, like there was a higher probability that they would actually use it and that it would be out in their space instead of going into a drawer, instead of going into their closet. And so we wanted to, create like an object that had utility. They could use it during the actual session, but also we wanted them to have more options to be reminded to use it again. They already enjoyed it, so like we really sort of hit the nail on the head. But like, I think even if the service wasn't as sort of enjoyable, there's a higher probability that it would stay out where they could see it more often, I think. There's no counterfactual to that. So like, I'm sort of just projecting now, but like there was intention behind making it sort of look the way that it did, because we wanted people to want to have it out therefore being reminded to use it more and more. And the pricing was not right, like at all. For Spora Mamas, we gave that away for free because it was the first year, it was a new product, a new type of service. The data and the outcomes were more valuable than charging some of these women that were on Medicaid that got sort of comparable services for free, but chose to use our solution. It was more valuable to get their experience than to try to charge them something that we knew was going to be wrong and we were going to change it in the future. But even the $10 for folks to get access to their GPs was definitely too low. And we ran out of time to really figure out what the right number was, but it didn't matter. Like, we just needed to get people using it and get people experiencing what the care was like, because that was the most important piece, not sort of, yeah, the affordability was important, but it was also like important to, because we knew that we had a markedly better experience than the status quo. And so it was just trying to lower the barriers as much as possible to get people using it.
I just have a very quick follow-up question for before, which is that, so I didn't mean at all to criticize neither the film nor your product. It's rather about the aspect of saying like what it is, and also saying on the other side what something else could be. So my question for regarding the film was, if, I mean, for example, the outcome you showed, like this cloud, the Mentimeter, with the results, where you said that people don't react like this to papers. So I was wondering if what do you think, how important it is to react like this to science, and what the role of emotion in judging results is in different areas of research, because I think this also really depends on the subject that you're working on. I think in your area, as you say, it's important to communicate not only with the scientists, the results, but also with the people who are affected by what you're studying. And I mean, of course, often research, because it's so complicated, it stays kind of among the scientists. And yeah, so I think how you plan to balance, I mean, you already balance it quite impressively with the projects you do, but how you think that academic science in general should find this balance between being emotional and being quantitative, let's say it like this.
Well, it's not that quantitative can't be emotional, can it? It's not necessarily, it's not mutually exclusive. What I think is it really depends on what you would like to achieve. And in that particular case, what I wanted to achieve is a tool that can be used to raise awareness about a topic, to deliver information. In the whole film, you will see again and again Professor Atwoli, who explains the exact link between, racism as a stressor, this is what it's doing to your body, etc. So there's scientific elements in there. I narrate, so I add additional data from, all the people that I've interviewed. And so I wanted to create something that can be used for awareness raising, advocacy, information, and most importantly, discourse. And so I think the likelihood of people sitting in a room jointly watching a film that they can relate to in one way or another, either because they've experienced discrimination themselves, or because they've witnessed it, or because they realize, oh, actually, I have quite a few biases that are being brought to light here that I wasn't aware of, and hence there's some sort of engagement there, is way more likely to trigger a conversation and a dialogue. And then perhaps, that's the hope, it's not that easy, obviously, but more self-reflection and change in behavior in the long term. I don't think that necessarily happens if you give people an academic paper and a few graphs, and that's that. And also in a paper, when thinking about working qualitatively, I would cite parts of an interview, right? And of course, the film, you also edit. So still, you kind of, decide what to show and what not to show. But in the paper, it's always me commenting on what people have said. Oh, this relates to that theory. Oh, this probably means that. In the film, I absolutely do not that. I let people speak for themselves. And I think, especially again, in this type of research, that really matters. This is what people say. This is their experience. And here I withdraw. And if anything, I will say something like, yes, I've heard that multiple times. But I'm not going to go, as in my paper, and, start analyzing all of these things. So again, I think it really depends on why you're doing that and what your goal is. And for the goal that I had, meaning giving something tangible to these people that I study, the film seemed to be exactly the right medium to do that.
Maybe coming to an end now, I think we're taking a lot home, a lot to kind of digest. But for me, what was really, really inspiring today is to understand like how important the artistic approach, a design methodology, or kind of just the creative thinking can really lead to, you always call it actionable outcomes. No, how it can impact. That's the word that you used. And how there also the arts can play, or design can play a very big role in that communication between also of the sciences. That's maybe something to kind of reflect upon. And also in the training was mentioned a couple of times, how in both worlds, in the academic, scientific world, as well as the artistic world, how this can already be included in the training, in the education, that we become aware of the role or responsibility that we could take there to make it more accessible and approachable, because it's for the people at the end of the day. So thank you for that. Great food for thought. Thank you all for coming despite sweating and despite the heat. Thank you for the Charité. And I think, Hannah, you want to say something?
Yes, can I quickly, so this is, I'm making a little bit of an advertisement here.
Please.
Because I'm so passionate about science communication, some colleagues and I are organizing a science communication workshop on the 13th and 14th of November here in Charité. Well, not at Charité in Spreefeld, but here in Berlin. And so I have a few flyers here, and it's going to be really creative. So the title is Creativity for Equity. So in case you're interested, come by, pick up some flyers, and thanks for giving